Meantime, the Justice Department yesterday releasing previously unseen documents from the Epstein files related to a woman who made accusations against President Trump. Now, the documents include news summaries from 2019 when the FBI interviewed a woman who made those allegations against both Epstein and the president. The woman claims she was assaulted by Trump in the 1980s when she was between the ages of 13 and 15. The president has consistently maintained any wrongdoing. It's unclear whether the
from something much simpler and far more powerful. The decisions were written down. They exist inside the internal machinery of government. Emails exchanged between cabinet secretaries, memorandums drafted by senior policy advisors, chat logs between White House aides, communications between the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and congressional allies. Every administration generates these records when it plans and coordinates major decisions. They are the administrative fingerprints of power, and according to multiple reports, those fingerprints now form a paper trail that could become the most serious legal vulnerability of Trump's presidency. Because once government actions are documented, they cannot simply be denied. They can be reconstructed, and if political power shifts in Washington, they can be subpoenaed. The paper trail that could become evidence. Consider the developing controversy surrounding the administration's military planning connected to Venezuela. Inside the government, officials reportedly debated whether certain operations, especially the possibility of land strikes, would legally require authorization from Congress under the War Powers framework. Some aides privately acknowledged that authorization might be required. Yet at the same time, the administration publicly argued that no such authorization was necessary. That gap matters, because if internal emails or memorandums show that senior officials privately recognized legal obstacles while publicly claiming those obstacles did not exist, investigators could view those documents as evidence that the legal justification was constructed after the fact. In legitimate executive branch decision-making, the process normally works in a specific order. First comes the legal analysis. Government lawyers review the Constitution, statutes, and relevant precedents to determine what actions are legally authorized. Only after that analysis do policymakers decide what to do. But when internal documents reveal the opposite sequence, when the decision appears to come first and the legal justification appears later, it raises serious questions about whether the legal rationale was simply crafted to justify a decision that had already been made. That pattern is exactly the kind of evidence congressional investigators look for, and senators from both parties have already begun demanding documentation explaining how the legal justification for the Venezuela operation evolved. The election. Administration controversy, another area where critics believe a significant paper trail may exist, involves the administration's approach to election administration. Legal analysts and democracy advocates argue that the White House, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and certain congressional allies have explored strategies that would increase federal influence over state voting procedures. If those discussions occurred, and if they involved coordinated efforts to pressure states on specific election rules, they would almost certainly have generated extensive documentation. A directive from the White House to the Justice Department about a state voting rule would generate emails. A DHS policy analysis about federal authority over election procedures would generate memorandums. Conversations between congressional leadership and administration officials about legislative strategies would generate additional communications. Each individual document might appear routine, but taken together, investigators could reconstruct the entire chain of coordination. That is how major political investigations often unfold. Not through one dramatic smoking gun, but through hundreds of smaller records that gradually reveal how decisions were made. Why internal documents are more dangerous than public statements. Public statements by politicians can always be framed as rhetoric. A speech can be described as exaggeration. A social media post can be dismissed as political messaging. But internal communications are different. They are not designed for public consumption. They often contain candid assessments, legal warnings, and strategic discussions that never appear in public messaging. If a private email shows that officials understood certain actions to be legally questionable, that email becomes powerful evidence. It documents not just what happened, but what the decision-makers knew when it happened. That knowledge is critical in legal and congressional investigations, because it shows intent, historical precedent. The DOJ data seizure scandal. There is also historical precedent for how these situations unfold. During Trump's earlier presidency, the Department of Justice secretly obtained communications data from members of Congress and their staff as part of leak investigations. When that information eventually surfaced, it triggered an Inspector General investigation and congressional hearings. Lawmakers demanded testimony from senior officials, including former attorneys general. The internal communications surrounding the decision became central evidence. They revealed who authorized the actions, who knew about them, and how the legal justification was constructed. That episode involved a relatively narrow issue, but it demonstrated a broader pattern. Once internal records reach congressional investigators, they can trigger a cascade of accountability. Informal channels. The signal. Chat problem. Another vulnerability involves informal communication channels. Modern administrations frequently use encrypted messaging platforms like Signal to coordinate sensitive discussions. Those conversations are often more candid than formal memorandums. Participants write quickly, sometimes without considering how the messages might appear later in an investigation. Reports have suggested that certain operational discussions, including military planning details, were shared in such channels. If congressional investigators ever gain access to those communications, they could provide a real-time window into how officials were thinking about controversial decisions as they happened. Unlike carefully drafted policy documents, chat messages often reveal raw, unfiltered reactions. That makes them particularly valuable in reconstructing decision-making processes. The political variable, control of the House, all of this leads to a single political variable that could determine whether the paper trail ever becomes public: control of the House of Representatives. Right now, the House majority has the power to decide whether subpoenas are issued. If that majority remains aligned with the administration, internal records may remain largely shielded. But if control of the House shifts after the 2026 elections, subpoena power would shift with it. And that change could immediately activate investigations targeting internal communications about war powers, election administration, emergency declarations, and other controversial decisions. According to political reporting, strategists from both parties are already preparing for that possibility. Opposition lawmakers are mapping out potential investigations and identifying specific categories of documents they would seek. Administration officials, meanwhile, are aware that such requests could come. That awareness creates its own legal pressure. Federal records laws impose strict rules on preserving official communications. Any attempt to destroy or improperly manage documents could itself become evidence in a future investigation. The core reality. The key point is simple. The potential vulnerability is not a single leaked document. It is the existence of thousands of internal records already sitting inside government systems: emails, memorandums, chat logs, policy drafts, legal analyses, each one documenting who proposed what, who approved what, and what legal concerns were raised during the process. Those documents cannot be unwritten. They already exist. The only unanswered question is whether investigators will ever gain the authority to demand them. The stakes, that is why the political stakes surrounding the 2026 elections are so significant. Control of Congress determines who controls subpoena power, and subpoena power determines whether the existing paper trail becomes the foundation of congressional investigations. If power remains unchanged, the documents may remain largely protected. But if the political arithmetic shifts, the internal communications behind some of the most controversial decisions of Trump's presidency could become central evidence in high-profile investigations. The most aggressive actions of a presidency are rarely defined only by speeches. They are defined by decisions. And in modern government, every major decision leaves documentation. Those records are sitting inside federal systems right now. Every email about military communications behind some of the most controversial decisions of Trump's presidency could become central evidence in high-profile investigations. The most aggressive actions of a presidency are rarely defined only by speeches. They are defined by decisions. And in modern